Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and a realistic journey to 100K. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So there's a lot of channels, of course, that have covered the bullish scenario on the journey to a $100,000 Bitcoin. And they could be right. If you're not familiar with the theory or the thinking, it's that this will ultimately be a V-shaped recovery, which will take us back to new highs by the end of the summer, and then pushing 100K, depending on who you ask, some by September, October, some by the end of the year. Okay, so that is one theory, and we will contend that it's a possibility. This theory is covered in many different places. And so I'm not going to spend 20 minutes talking about a theory that most of you are probably already aware of. The general idea, though, is just, hey, this could just be one of these corrections that we had, like we had back in, around this time as measured from the bottom in the last market cycle. And we're going to get back on course very quickly. Okay, you guys are fully aware of that theory. Good chance it plays out. If it does, come September, October, it will be fairly apparent. It will be fairly apparent if that's playing out, and we will reassess the situation at the time. Let's take another look. Let's take another look at a potential journey to 100K. One that would be a little bit more bearish, but still lead us to a six-figure Bitcoin. Okay, and that scenario would not entail an immediate bounce like this, okay? And I think one of the things is that everyone assumes that just because it bounced at a certain time last market cycle is going to do the exact same thing this cycle. If anything, we know that this cycle has been ahead of schedule for quite a long time, in fact. And so could it fall behind schedule now, which is what we've speculated, that this cycle will ultimately fall behind and then go up later and put in a slightly lower ROI with a lengthened cycle? Could that play out? So what would be a realistic path to 100K in the event that we do not get a V-shaped recovery? So in the event that the cycle theory of 100K or 200K or the more lofty projections I've seen of 300K, in the event that we do not get a V-shaped recovery in the short term and immediately start trending higher, which is what we would have to do to make it, especially to those $300,000 valuations, what would be another path that still could make a whole lot of sense? Okay, we're going to look at that potential path. So one path would be the idea that we go into a brief bear market. Okay, a brief bear market. And what that could look like is it could look similar to 2019, potentially, where instead of capitulating everything immediately, it ends up being sort of a prolonged bleed for a few months, and then ultimately we gear back up. Now, imagine we go back to say 20K. This would be a very bearish target that a lot of people would not want to see. Imagine we do go back and test that level. What could, in fact, it look like in the event that that were to happen? Well, one of the things we can note is if it does continue to play out like 2019, which is it's actually bleeding a little bit quicker than 2019. As we said, it will not, nothing's going to behave exactly the same. You can't really take any fractal for Bitcoin and expect it to line up exactly. Okay, you can't expect it to line up exactly. But if you just take a look here, there could be some similarities in it. And if something like that were to happen, it might not happen next month. Okay, it might not happen next month. Just like when we started moving up, it's not like we immediately went to 64K. It took us over a year to get there. So if in fact we are entering a slight bleed for a while, you may say, well, how did you come up with, say 6 months? Like how would we come up with that? Well, one idea would be to look at, say, the bull market support band, which we talk about. And to recognize that a lot of times when we fall below it, in order to get back above it and then retest it as support can take about 6 months. It can take about 6 months. And you can see it happen here to here, and then this one to testing it here again took about 6 months as well. So imagine we do get the weekly close below the bull market support band, which we haven't even gotten yet. Okay, we haven't gotten that yet. Then if we were to go about 6 months out, we could be looking closer to the end of the year before we're able to get back above it and maybe test it as support, maybe even early next year if it's slightly longer. So this would be the bearish case. And you might say, well, if this is the bearish case, why does that imply a $100,000 Bitcoin is still coming? Well, I've told you guys before that in my opinion, institutions FOMOing it up here, it did not make a whole lot of sense. It made more sense to me that there's going to be a lot of institutions that do want to get a decent position in Bitcoin, and they don't want to be the schmuck coming in at 64K. Now they can get it at a 50% discount. I imagine there are some institutions buying quietly that we don't know about. And so that's why I'm not necessarily convinced that we're ever going to go back to 20K. I'm not necessarily convinced that we're going to go back to 20K. But I do think that there is a high enough probability of it happening that if you completely discount it, then you're not doing yourselves any favors. The people in 2017 who said a $3,000 Bitcoin can never happen again, they were eating their words. So if the idea is, well, it can never go to 20K because we've never tested a prior all-time high after passing it, well, last cycle we never had a 50% drop. We never had a weekly close below the bull market support band last cycle. So clearly this cycle is putting out some different characteristics than the last cycle had. Again, one of the things we've said is it looks more akin to the 2013 cycle, which was a double peak cycle, and we did have a brief bear market where we didn't put in a new all-time high immediately. We did not have a V-shaped recovery. In fact, by the time we put in a new all-time high, it was more than half a year away. Okay, it was more than half a year away. So the idea that we have to have a V-shaped recovery just because this was a V-shaped recovery doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, considering that so far a lot about this cycle looks very different from the last cycle. So one of the other things we can do is put on our regression band and say, well, what if we were to extend this out and it were to slowly move up something like this, and we ultimately come back down and just briefly touch it at around 25K, maybe not 20K, maybe at around 25K. Probably not going to have like a pandemic drop in the event that the bearish scenario plays out. But what if it briefly touches it, allowing people to really load up if they haven't already, and then it begins the trek to 100K, and a very bullish case at that. That would be when I would be fully, 100K, somewhere between 1 to 200K. Now, another interesting thing is if we draw this trend line at these sort of where we were generally moving up, it would also correspond to generally the same area, right? It would also correspond to that same area more or less. And then also another thing is the most bearish case, generally speaking, with Bitcoin is in fact the 200-week moving average. Now, the 200-week moving average normally is hit at the bottom of a bear market, but because of how quickly we've been moving up and all this intra-cycle volatility we've had, it's actually moving up relatively quickly already. And we can imagine that if it keeps doing this, it's not going to take that many more months for it to get to 20 to 25K itself, maybe about half a year. So what if that is what's coming first before the immediate move to 100K? So again, you'll get the theory on the immediate move to 100K on every other channel, and I think there is at least a non-negligible chance that they're right, and so we should pay attention to a V-shaped recovery closing above the bull market support band and immediately heading back up. We need to pay attention to that because there's a non-negligible chance that it happens. We also should not act in a deterministic way and assume that it has to play out like that, because a lot of those theories were not calling for a 50 to 60% drop here. Most of those theories were not calling for that. On this channel, we have been discussing for a long time the implication of a double peak cycle, where the first one is a fairly impulsive move. We come down more than 30 or 40%. where we drop. I mean, this was a 74% drop. So imagine if we were to drop not quite as much, maybe 60% or so, then that would also correspond to that level. And you might say, well, this was also a fairly, once we got 6 months out, we then immediately put a new all-time high and a new paradigm shift in the price of Bitcoin. So couldn't that happen again, where it just goes sideways for 3 or 4 months, and then it just goes up like 3 or 4x? I think it's unlikely. If you look at the time between, say, this peak and then this one, it was 672 days. And then if this is a double peak cycle and you take the time between this one and this one, it was over 1,100 days, almost 1,200 days. So if we were to say go from this peak to then this one, it was around 910 days. So this was a little bit longer. I would also expect this one to be stretched out as well, and therefore I wouldn't expect it to go up immediately, because you can see that the time between this peak and then the intermediate peak of the next cycle was almost 700 days. This one was almost 1,200 days. Okay, so there are differences. Therefore, if the bearish scenario plays out, then I would not necessarily expect that by November or December, if we're trading at, say, 20 or 30K, I wouldn't necessarily expect that means it's going to immediately shoot to $100,000 like it would have if it were continuing to exactly mimic 2013. But we know it's not mimicking 2013 exactly because of the time frame. Everything's getting stretched out a little bit more. Even the distance between this first peak and that first sort of fake rally, that was 217 days. This one, the fake rally was 553 days. So you can see that a lot of things about this cycle are just getting stretched out in this cycle. Additionally, another similarity is the pi cycle top indicator, which we've spoken about before. It did work out fairly well, and you can see that it did show a pi cycle top right here at around 64K or so, and also in 2013 we had a pi cycle top at that intermediate top. So then the question becomes, well, how do we know if it's a market cycle top? How do we know if it's a market cycle top, or whether it's just a local top before we ultimately trend higher? I mean, I think it's too early to know for sure. I'm fairly convinced that Bitcoin will trend to 6 figures within the next couple of years or so. I've maintained my stance on that for a long time, that the journey to a 6-figure Bitcoin between 1 to 200K would likely not end in 2021, but likely extend beyond. And so imagine that this does play out, or some rendition of it. Another thing too is, even if we were just to go sideways for a while, we're gonna get further and further away from this upper line. But regardless, imagine this does play out, and we sort of hit this trend line here. We hit that 200-week moving average by the end of the year or something, and then we do trend back up. And we it's a slower grind. We do something like this. We maybe flirt with those prior levels for a while, and then we end up putting in our cycle peak somewhere over here, and then we trend back down. And then you can imagine, you extend this out, it would look something like that. And then so maybe if you connect the dots here, you would have these three major moves over the course of a few years. And then this cycle might be remembered as another double peak cycle, or if you prefer, a triple peak cycle if you include the one in 2019. Maybe it would be the first peak in 2019, the second peak in 2021, and then maybe the third peak in 2023, which obviously would be a short-term bearish scenario if it were to play out like that. And I know a lot of people don't want that to happen, and we're certainly not saying it's going to happen. It's just the V-shaped recovery and immediate move to 100K has been covered everywhere. And so it might be prudent for us to look at things in a slightly different way, so that we're not just turning into an echo chamber. Okay, so that would be one potential approach. And then you get something maybe that looks like this. So you get like the first little pocket, the second little pocket, and then a much longer third pocket. Okay, so that would sort of be the scenario that we're talking about. This is in the event that the V-shaped recovery does not play out. And in order for us to have a little bit more insight into that, I think we just need a few more weeks. Okay, my guess is that sometime in the next few weeks, Bitcoin's probably going to get some type of rally. And at that point, we're going to have to figure out, can it get back above the bull market support band? Okay, can it get back above the 20-week SMA? If we come back up to it like we did in 2019, you can see we had a massive drop below it. We consolidated for a few weeks, we came back up, we got rejected, and then we just came back down. If something like that happens again, so we came below it, let's say we consolidate for a few weeks, if we come back up and then get rejected at like 50K, then I think there's more evidence to suggest that we're going to go back down for a little while before going back up. That is what I would say. We want to see if, can Bitcoin get back above the bull market support band? We cannot know this in a day. We cannot know it in a week. Let's look to see what the summer brings. Okay, if we're in June and we're still below the bull market support band, and we're in July and we're still below it. If we're still below it, that means the prices are probably generally trending down because the bull market support band will be coming down too. So if we just go sideways, then eventually it'll come back to us. But if we just go down for a little bit, go back up and test it and get rejected, then I think there's more evidence to suggest that lengthening cycle theory will stand the test of time, and that we're getting these intermediate impulsive moves, that ultimately take us to a third leg later on before the next halving. That's the key thing, I think. Because a lot of people might say, well, what would differentiate it? A lot of people think that, the halving is ultimately the catalyst. And so the implication of this is I do think Bitcoin will go to six figures before the next halving, which is sometime out in 2024. So I do think it'll go to six figures before the next halving, which is why even if we get a short-term bear market for 3 to 6 months, I still would consider it to be part of the same cycle. Okay, we've been discussing the same thing for years now. We've been talking about the potentiality of lengthened cycles. In the last 6 months, we talked about more so what's the potential of a double peak cycle like we had over here in 2013. You might wonder, well, this one over here already sort of touched this logarithmic regression band up here. You're right, it did. We didn't have any weekly closes above it. We certainly didn't have these major moves to the top part of it like we did the last two times, which even went above it. If we had, we would have been going closer to 100K already, but you can see we did get rejected. Remember, this is only fit to 3 data points, these peaks. So 1, 2, and 3. It's only fit to 3 data points, so there's going to be some uncertainty already. We added an uncertainty band. There's going to be some uncertainty with it. The thinking that I have here is that, ultimately speaking, if you believe that Bitcoin's going to 6 figures, right? If you believe it's going to go to 6 figures, then I don't think it really makes a whole lot of difference, especially if you just have a DCA approach, which I think is the best approach for the market. If you're trying to time the market identically, where it's going to bottom, obviously I wish you luck, but that's certainly not something that we can exactly tell you where that will happen. There's a lot of people calling for a $25,000 Bitcoin. There's a lot of people calling for it to go to 70K or 80K within the next couple of months. Give us a couple months. Once we're say at near the end, getting into the summer, and maybe by the end of the summer, I think it's going to be fairly obvious what's going on, whether we're going into a lengthening cycle where the journey to 100K takes a lot longer, or whether we're going into the often predicted 4-year cycle where we immediately go to 100K this year. Now, the elephant in the room, which I will address, we will address it, of course, is, could this be the market cycle peak? What does that even mean? Like, what would need to happen for me to consider that the market cycle peak? Well, again, this is something we're not going to know for a long time. I'm convinced that it's not the market cycle peak, but I'm also open to things going bearish for a few months before trending higher. And I still would consider this to be just the same cycle. We would just maybe have, 3 intermediate peaks. So 1 peak, 2 peak, and then maybe a 3rd peak up here. But what would need to happen? Well, if something like this were to happen, which again is, I don't think this is going to happen. Let me be clear. I don't think this is going to happen. But if something like this were to happen where we come back down and then don't bounce off this, Okay, we don't bounce off of it, but instead we come back down and go back down to these really low levels closer to 10K and then come back to the bull market or come back to the regression line, and we trade like that until the next halving and then move up, then I think it would be fairly obvious that this was the market cycle peak. That is how I would identify it, because in order to get a market cycle, you really need sort of a long consolidation phase. And you can see that this consolidation, it was a long bear market, about a year. This was a year bear market followed by about a year consolidation, and then a general move up. Again, another year bear market, a couple, maybe a year and a half of consolidation, and then we started to have a move up. So now what I think as we move forward, there are two main paths to 100K. There's two main paths to $100,000 Bitcoin. Okay, the first path would be a V-shaped recovery within the next few months, probably sooner than that, probably within at least by maybe by June, July, a V-shaped recovery where we're putting in new highs, and then we just go immediately put in 100K. If we get this V-shaped recovery, then I think closer to 100K is going to be the cycle top. I don't think it's going to be able to push to like 300K like is often projected. I think this would probably be the cycle top if it were to push to 100K by the end of the year. And then if we don't get the V-shaped recovery and we come back down into a more bearish scenario and then go up like that, then I think this would probably go higher, maybe to 150K or closer to 200K, depending on how long it takes. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. Also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. If you want to know how I'm navigating these markets, make sure you check out the sale on the premium list. You can find a link to that in the description below. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Bye.